It is my pleasure to welcome you all to Northern Kentucky History Hour. I am your host for tonight, Mary Jane Calderon, joining you from my home in Fort Wright, Kentucky. Also joining me by the power of Zoom is our guest presenter, Jessica Whitehead, and my assistant for this evening, BCM Visitor Services Associate, Heather Cook. So thank you both so much for being here. Northern Kentucky History Hour is a project of Behringer-Crawford Museum, Northern Kentucky's History Museum, that would not be possible without support. Thank you to all of our sponsors, including the City of Covington, Kenton County Fiscal Court, ArtsWave, Kentucky Arts Council, Northern Kentucky Sports Hall of Fame, and our members. If you are not yet a member of the museum, please consider joining for access to discounts and exclusive programming. Learn more and join at bcmuseum.org. There you go. We would love to hear from our viewers tonight. So if you have a question or comment to share, please type it in the chat or the Q&A feature, and I will be sure to get to those at the end of the presentation. Now let's meet tonight's presenter. Hold on, let me read this. Jessica Whitehead is the curator of collections for the Kentucky Derby Museum and has recently written The History of the Kentucky Derby in 75 Objects, published through University Press of Kentucky. Outside of the Derby Museum, Jessica has studied Harlan Hubbard since her student days at Hanover, class of 2011, curating multiple exhibits in the region and providing the introduction to the watercolors of Harlan Hubbard, released in 2021. The highly anticipated Driftwood, curated by Jessica Whitehead and based on her book, Driftwood, The Life of Harlan Hubbard, will debut as an exhibit on April 13th at Behringer-Crawford Museum. She served as a founding board member of the new nonprofit Payne Hollow on the Ohio, where she still manages its collection of artifacts. She is currently a board member for the Kentucky Museum and Heritage Alliance. Now, before we get started, there is a quiz question tonight. The first respondent to enter the correct answer in the chat on Zoom or Facebook Live wins a Northern Kentucky History Hour prize. And most importantly, bragging rights. So tonight's question is, what is Harlan Hubbard's legal first name? Go ahead and get those answers in the chat. And then Jessica, if you are ready, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you and we can go ahead and get started.
Awesome. All right, let me share my screen here. Can everybody see? Very good. All right. Well, I'm so pleased to be here with you all this evening. I hope everybody who was dealing with any snow is nice and cozy at home. I am coming to you from New Albany, Indiana, where I am currently cozy from the snow. And I'm thrilled to be able to share a story with you tonight that really has occupied my mind for more than a decade. As you heard from my bio, I first started working with Harlan Hubbard when I was a student at Hanover College, and it just sort of snowballed from there. And so before I get started, I also wanted to say that this talk exists to whet your appetite for a larger meal. So this is a huge story with lots of characters, lots of scenes, lots of moving parts. And I'm so grateful to finally be able to say for the first time that the things I don't cover in this presentation will finally be available to you to read in the comfort of your own home from my new biography, which is Driftwood, The Life of Harlan Hubbard, published by the University Press of Kentucky. And the official publication date for that book is February 25th, so a couple weeks from now. But a little birdie told me that if you order it from the press, you just might get it a little bit early. So feel free to check out their website, University Press of Kentucky, and grab your copy if you like what you hear today. Now, I was never fortunate enough to meet either Harlan or Anna. Both of them died just before I was born. And so my introduction to the Hubbard story has been through the legacy that they left behind. And that comes in the form of the stories that folks like you maybe have, who knew them, have shared with me over the years. But it also comes from the really extraordinary volume of manuscripts, of letters, photographs, artworks, objects, structures that are available for me to study now that have come down through history. And one of the first of these artifacts that I ever got to encounter was this painting that you're seeing here on the screen. And my alma mater, Hanover College in Southern Indiana, I used to have this hanging behind the library circulation desk while I was attending school there. And I really found myself just distracted by its beauty every time I was checking out books or signing in for work study duty in the archives, long before I ever knew anything about the artist who had signed the work in the corner, Harlan Hubbard. And what's special to me now, as I look back at more than a decade of intense research into the Hubbard since seeing this painting, is how this painting, unbeknownst to me at the time, was really drawing me toward the core of the Hubbard story, just like the river drew Harlan and Anna toward their eventual home at Payne Hollow. But we'll get to that. First, I want to orient you to why the book is called what it's called, why it's called Driftwood. And you'll notice on the typescript that's on the screen that the original title of Harlan's breakout book, Shantyboat, from 1953, which many of you may have read, the original title was Driftwood. That eventually changed, but my biography honors that fact. And it also celebrates Harlan's consistent use of driftwood as a thing, as a metaphor for the human condition. And then second, I want to orient you to how my book starts, because I think it's a really helpful way to enter the Hubbard story. Driftwood begins in media res, or in the middle of the action. And that's appropriate because there are really two very distinct acts in Harlan Hubbard's life, both of which are equally important to understanding his character. And so coming in the middle, you get to see him before Anna and after Anna. I like to call it the BA and AA periods. And Anna, of course, being Harlan's eventual wife, who he married in the mid 1940s and became sort of the catalyst to a enormous change in his life that created this second act. And when we meet Harlan in the beginning of Driftwood, he is meditating on Ohio River floods. And he's expressing his distress as he's meditating on the idea of floods, that he is so restless and dissatisfied in his life. And he writes in his journal, this is in 1933 that he's writing this, "I've been affected by this rise of water. It suggested primeval times when the earth was being made. It separated the earth from the works of man. I saw my true dwelling place. I need a flood in my soul to carry off all that old drift and flimsy habits that have extended down to the water's edge. It will come, causing suffering and loss. If it does not come, the river will become stagnant, filled with growth and mud." And what I've just read to you, I think, gives us a very unfamiliar glimpse of a figure who nearly a century later holds an honored place in Kentucky arts and letters as a maverick, as an inspiration. And what we'll be discussing today is how this radical transformation occurred and what those forces were that shaped and molded Harlan Hubbard, like Driftwood, from an awkward and overlooked person to a fulfilled and revered Kentucky figure. So we'll go back to the beginning, of course, because this is a biography. So we'll go back to the very beginning, to Harlan's family and his childhood that was spent not far from where many of you are sitting right now, in the hilly river town of Bellevue, Kentucky, where he was born William Harlan Hubbard on January 4th, 1900. And incidentally, to those of you who are historians, you will appreciate how magnificent it is to have a main subject who was born right at the turn of a century, because I never have to do math to figure out Harlan's age at any given time, for which I am eternally grateful. And on the screen, you are seeing Harlan's parents. This is Frank Gilbert Hubbard and Rose Ann Swingle. And the pair met while Frank Gilbert was working for Rose's brother, Calvin, at a furniture factory in Champaign, Illinois, where they were both living at the time. And at that time, too, Rose, and this was the 1890s, keep in mind, Rose was working as a typesetter for the Champaign Daily Gazette, and she took great pride in being an independent woman at work. And from family stories, it is clear that Rose harbored some ambitions to maybe be a journalist or a writer in her own right, and that she may have looked at her work at the Gazette as a leg up to that future. What is not exactly clear is why, when Frank came along, Rose decided to marry him. Although Harlan never went as far as to claim that his childhood was unhappy, Harlan's parents were not necessarily the best suited for one another. And this became a point of fascination later in life for Harlan, which you can read about a little bit more in the book. But by the time Harlan had arrived in 1900, Frank Gilbert and Rose already had two much older sons. And so the first photo you see here is Frank Lafayette Hubbard, who was born in 1887, their first son. And then you see second photo, Lucian Swingle Hubbard. They called him Louis. And he was born exactly 2 years to the day after Frank in 1889. And both Frank and Lucian, who I mentioned, they called Louis, were well into their schooling and already sort of thinking about their careers, about their future when Harlan arrived. And there's little Harlan, of course, holding his little tin horn. And for that reason, Harlan's childhood was really colored by the ambitions and the interests of his older brothers. Frank, the eldest, wanted to be an artist and was studying to be an artist. Louis wanted to be a writer. And so it seems only natural that Harlan would eventually develop ambitions for each of these crafts as well. But Frank and Louis instilled in Harlan another really essential interest besides writing and besides art. All three Hubbard brothers, as well as really most of their peers that they were growing up with in Bellevue, were river rats. You know, they were spending as much time as possible canoeing, swimming, fishing, otherwise playing in and around and on the Ohio. And Frank, Harlan's brother, writing to Harlan in the 1970s, remembered to his brother, "You, Harlan, came to love the river when you were no taller than our canoe paddle," which is such a great, great quote. But in his brother Frank, Harlan also found a kindred artist. And both Frank and Harlan were sensitive and curious observers of their surrounding landscape, of their surrounding culture. And the brothers spent their time outdoors as much sketching as they did exploring when they were together. And Frank had, in 1906, graduated from the Ohio Mechanics Institute in Cincinnati with a specialization in technical drawing, which he hoped to use to find work as a commercial illustrator. And as a result, Frank was a deeply accomplished draftsman, which actually was very fortunate for him because he was, in fact, colorblind. So through drawing and printmaking, Frank found a monochromatic method to express his creativity, and he dedicated as much time as he could to passing those skills on to his younger brother. And on the screen, you actually see two sketches of Frank's from these years. One is a quick study of a beach shantyboat across the river from Cincinnati, which is a compelling clue to where Harlan's keen interest in shantyboats may have come from, that we'll talk about later. And the other is a beautiful and touching study that Frank completed of his brother Harlan, who's shown at age 7 doing a sketch of his own at an easel, probably under the careful instruction of his brother Frank. Now, in 1907, Frank Gilbert Hubbard, their father, fell ill and died. And although Harlan was quite young when this took place, in 1907, of course, Harlan was 7, yay math, he had formed some very strong impressions of his father that he would express later in life. And in many ways, Harlan saw in his father a reflection of his own character. And I had mentioned that there was some tension in his parents' marriage. Well, one of the key tensions in his parents' marriage had been Frank Gilbert's apparent disinterest in pursuing traditional social status, in pursuing financial gain, which Rose Hubbard, Harlan's mother, who was very keenly interested in those things, sort of resented about her husband. And she was irritated by her husband's contentment in subsisting as this sort of odd jobs handyman and hobbyist tinkerer. And it basically heightened her dissatisfaction with her own lack of career, which, if you'll remember, Rose knew what it was like to work for a living, and she had never really let go of those ambitions. So, from Rose's perspective, their father, Frank Gilbert, seems a little pathetic, a little doomed to his own folly. But to his sons, Harlan and Frank especially, and I don't mention Louis because Louis was much more like Rose than he was like his father. Uh, Frank Gilbert was something of a tragic hero to Harlan and Frank when he died. And Harlan writes in the 1970s, if our father were living today, he could be more true to himself and suffer less in spirit. Public opinion has become more lenient to the Hubbard temperament. The importance of worldly success, the struggle for ever higher standards of living, the ideas of progress and increasing bigness, of man's domination over nature, once as unquestioned as the Bible, all are becoming suspect now that the environmental disaster brought about by a rash and selfish application of technology is realized. No one that I know has chosen to give away his worldly goods, but there is a new incentive to do so, an added honor and integrity to voluntary poverty. It is the rich who waste the earth. And from our perspective, of course, looking back on these words with the knowledge of how Harlan's own life would develop, we can see how much Harlan was writing about himself when he wrote about his father here. But Frank Gilbert Hubbard's death was nevertheless a significant shift for Rose and her three sons. He had been, in his meager way, the provider for his family, and so his death placed a significant burden on the eldest two sons to support their mother and youngest brother. Fortunately for Rose and Harlan, both Louis and Frank were finding success in their chosen fields. Louis, who had been working for several years already as a reporter for newspapers out of Cincinnati, Chicago, New Orleans, he received an exciting offer in 1912 to serve as a night editor at the New York Times. And so he and his new wife, Alice, relocated to New York City, and the rest of the Hubbard family, frankly, was soon to follow them. Frank, who had been hearing good things about the need for commercial illustrators in the bustling advertising world of Madison Avenue, so yes, Frank was a madman, moved to New York in 1914. And then Rose and Harlan arrived the following year. And between 1915 and 1921, Harlan and Rose divided their time between the Big Apple and Bellevue. And so they would spend their fall and winter in New York for Harlan's schooling, and they would spend their spring and summer back in Kentucky, mostly for Rose's social calendar. And the Hubbards had all settled within walking distance, really, of one another in the Tremont neighborhood of the Bronx. And Harlan loved exploring this new neighborhood, and he went on plenty of adventures in and around all the boroughs of New York. But of course, as can be expected, he was especially drawn to the Hudson River, the Harlem River, the East River. And he and his brother Louis, especially, would often take hiking excursions, for example, along the Palisades, and then would return by steamboat to the city. And these were really treasured times for Harlan, not only to spend so much wonderful time with his family, but also to be experiencing this new environment. And during this period, Harlan was also, of course, continuing his education. So Rose had enrolled him at Evander Childs High School in the Bronx, where he developed a particular interest in classical language and literature. He loved his studies in Latin and Greek. He was very talented with languages. And he also discovered a lifelong passion for the works of the poet Virgil, who was very important to him philosophically and literarily later on in his work. Harlan still did struggle, as he did for his entire childhood, to excel socially with his peers. However, perhaps especially with girls his age, which we'll talk about a little bit, but he had no problem impressing his instructors with his precocious mind. But Harlan was getting another kind of education too. Frank, who you see here in the center, his older brother, and Frank's soon-to-be wife, Frances, who you also see on the screen, really loved Harlan's company. They saw something in him, this spark in him, and they loved to escort him all around the city, taking him to concerts and exhibits and other kinds of cultural events whenever they had time. And after all, this would have been a really, really exciting time to be in New York City for somebody who loved art. Not only were there traditional museums filled with exciting masterworks from the East and the West and all over the world for Harlan to take in, there were also avant-garde exhibitions taking place at local galleries that were showcasing the cutting-edge stylistic innovations in the art world of modernism. But of course, this was also wartime. So we're talking about World War I here, and World War I affected Harlan Hubbard directly when in 1917 he learned that any high-achieving student at his high school could be eligible to serve in New York State's Farm Cadet Service Program. And Harlan spent two really remarkable summers providing manual labor to the upstate New York agricultural sector. And he was doing this because their workforce had been suffering due to the enlistment of many young men in the area into the armed forces who were being sent to Europe. And during his time with the Farm Cadet Service, Harlan learned some invaluable heirloom skills, things like handling a scythe properly, planting and harvesting crops, skills that would ultimately be essential to his and Anna's later life at Payne Hollow. And here on the screen, you're also looking at a really special discovery that I made when I was researching this book. A requirement of the Farm Cadet program was a culminating essay that students needed to write for their high school to earn class credit for the work that they had done upstate. And I was very fortunate to discover that the New York State Archives had preserved Harlan's culminating essay, which you see here on the screen and which you can read in full in my book. But to my knowledge, this is the earliest formal composition of Harlan's that has survived that we have access to. So a very exciting find. And I must note that this time upstate for Harlan was also the first time that he read Henry David Thoreau's Walden, which would become a foundational text to his life, foundational text to his work, and just overall one of the biggest influences on how he would develop as a person. Now, once Harlan returned from his time with the Farm Cadet Service and graduated from high school, Frank, his brother, encouraged him to channel his creative energy into a more formal artistic education. And Harlan enrolled in the very affordable but very traditional National Academy of Design in New York. And I say traditional conservative because the conservative classical art education still reigned there, which meant that basically Harlan spent his first year in a room with other artists sketching plaster casts of Greco-Roman statues. He was very good at this. He proved himself very accomplished as a draftsman, in no small part due to Frank's coaching for many years. And he even won a medal in 1919 for his sketch of a Greek bust. But Frank continued to be a really important ancillary educational force in Harlan's artistic development. And Frank really doted on his brother. You can tell how much he doted on his brother. He purchased him gifts of art books and art supplies that could help Harlan excel beyond what he was getting in his classes. He taught Harlan to paint in watercolors. And so the watercolor that you see here on the screen of this lovely potted plant is what we believe to have been the first watercolor study of Harlan's. And on Harlan's 19th birthday in 1919, Frank introduced his brother to oil paints for the first time and coached him through his very first oil painting, which you also see on the screen, which is Still Life of Onion, Carrot, and Tin Can. Now, later that year in 1919, Harlan graduated from drawing statuary at the National Academy to painting from life. And he really got the opportunity to put into use some of the techniques that he had been learning from Frank at home. And although figure studies and portraits would become really very rare in Harlan's oeuvre, we can tell from surviving examples that he was very skilled at painting the human form. And he was especially proud of this beautiful study of a woman. And actually, he later admitted in an interview that this class and this woman was the first time he had ever seen a woman without her clothes on. Oh, so as I mentioned, he was a bit of a slow starter where women were concerned, but this was a formative day for him in many, many ways. But all the while he was taking these more formal classes, while he was learning from Frank, Harlan was also continuing on his own to study artists that he admired, sketching their works in museums and galleries. He would sketch their works from art history books that were in Frank's studio. And one of the artists that would come to inspire him most during this period was James Abbott McNeill Whistler. And you can see on this page from Harlan's New York sketchbook how he was making careful composition and tone studies of some of Whistler's most famous paintings, including, of course, the groundbreaking Symphony in White, which is the largest figure on this page. And the influence of Whistler on Harlan's later New York work is almost inescapable when you consider it with pieces like these. The first photo that you see on the screen is one of Harlan's studies of old Madison Square Garden at night after the opera let out. And the second painting is a study of the harbor at the East River. And when you look at them next to this Whistler piece, which is his notorious nocturne in black and gold, The Falling Rocket from 1875, you can tell that Harlan clearly admired and sometimes tried to replicate Whistler's ability to render the sense or the feeling of a subject without tying it too concretely to naturalistic detail. But by 1921, Rose had grown tired of New York. She was tired of it. Both Louis and Frank had settled into their own lives and their own families. They were having children. They had less time for Rose. And she announced to Harlan that they were going to be returning home to Kentucky permanently that year. And even though he was disappointed, very much disappointed, in fact, to be losing the artistic and cultural advantages and to be leaving his family, to be leaving those advantages of New York, Harlan understood that now he was at the age of 21 after so many years of his elder brothers shouldering the burden, the financial burden of Rose and Harlan. Now it was Harlan's turn to support their mother financially. He understood this. Harlan also understood that he was not quite developed enough as an artist to try and support both of them through painting alone. So he began working as a day laborer in construction around northern Kentucky, all around Bellevue, Newport, Fort Thomas, Covington. And although he enjoyed the work, and he was never one to shirk away from hard work, shy away from hard work. He appreciated the important new skills, too, that he was adding to his arsenal. These are things that would carry on later to his life with Anna at Payne Hollow as well. He was also deeply dissatisfied, deeply restless. And he wrote of this period, "Arrived in Kentucky, I was depressed and at loose ends. I could take delight only in the season. In the early summer, the misty sun and gentle breeze from the south over the fragrant earth stirred longings within me as they did when I was a little boy, barefoot for the first time of the year. But I had little time for the poetry of spring." Harlan, in a very real way, may have recognized that he was living one of the most famous lines of his favorite book, Walden, that the mass of men live lives of quiet desperation. Now, despite his dissatisfaction, Harlan was actually very productive in this period. He enrolled in the Art Academy of Cincinnati for a brief time, trying to sort of rekindle the creative fire that he had been feeling in New York. That didn't really stick. He ultimately eschewed any kind of formal instruction. But on his own, Harlan continued to study and excel, studying the works of other artists, producing works that, as you can see in these examples on the screen, that varied widely in style and in technique. And as you can also see, Harlan was becoming especially adept at rendering his beloved Ohio River. And you see in works throughout this presentation his wonderful ability to capture light, to capture reflection, to capture the subtle movement of water. And this ability really carries through his work from the 1920s when these pieces were made until his death in the 1980s. And it transcends whatever medium he happens to be working in, be it oil, acrylic, watercolor, even woodblock printing. And so in 1923, after several years of working as a contractor under his tool belt, so to speak, he proposed to Rose that he design and build them a house in the beautiful Highlands neighborhood of Fort Thomas, Kentucky. And with some financial assistance from Louis and Frank, Harlan and Rose purchased a lot at 129 Highland Avenue in Fort Thomas. And Harlan got to work designing and building a very attractive bungalow that you see here on the screen from the 1920s, full of hand-built touches that can be seen on his later structures too. So this little house in Fort Thomas includes rough-hewn masonry foundations and exposed chimneys, things that you'll see in other buildings that he creates. In this period, Harlan and Rose also, perhaps to mitigate some of their restlessness, began to travel together again. And they would travel, fairly often to different places around the United States. But one of the main impetus for this kind of travel was Harlan's brother Louis, who in the 1920s stopped working in the newspaper business and became a screenwriter for motion pictures. And as one does, Louis and his family relocated to Hollywood to get better opportunities for screenwriting. And they relocated to Hollywood around the time that Harlan began building this house at 129 Highland Avenue. And during that construction, Rose actually spent a glamorous few months living in the Beverly Hills mansion of Louis while Harlan was back home in Fort Thomas building a house. But Harlan later commented, perhaps a little unkindly, that his mother lapped up all the glamour and attention of Louis's Hollywood life. And as you can imagine, Harlan disliked the superficiality of Hollywood once he visited there, but he really loved the wilderness of the American West and made a number of very impressive watercolors on their first trip to California together. And you're looking at one of those here on the screen. And they took that trip because Louis was becoming a very successful, not only writer, but producer in Hollywood. And in 1926, he asked Rose and Harlan to come for an extended stay in California to keep his family company while he was going to be filming on location in San Antonio for multiple months in Texas for a film called Wings, which ultimately would become the very first Academy Award winner for Best Picture. So pretty cool. Now, Harlan and Rose returned home in 1927 from California, and Harlan resolved that he was going to make a success of his situation. Although he was still tied to the well-being and support of his mother, although he was missing out on opportunities he felt to become a more established artist, he also understood that there were ways that he might distinguish himself as an artist right where he was. And he was, after all, in very beautiful country, as many of you know, this beautiful country that was a muse for many great American landscape painters before him. But what he needed, he knew, was an outpost away from Fort Thomas, where he could commune with his subject, which was nature, and lose himself in the genius loci, the spirit of place. And he established his first official artist studio in an old lumber mill in the hills above the river near Brent, Kentucky. So if you're familiar with the River Road on the Kentucky side, uh, Brent is around where California and some of those areas are. But Brent just seemed like a place where the frontier was ever present, where it was abundant, where it was brimming with inspiration for his painting. And his work, you're seeing some examples of his work. You're also seeing a very rare self-portrait of that Harlan did of himself, where he's looking very, very intense here in the center. But Harlan's work in the late 20s and early 30s that was completed at this new studio on Winters Lane are very distinctive. And we can see in the two examples on either side of the portrait that there are colliding influences of tonalism and Whistler, of Art Nouveau artists like Maxfield Parrish, of designers and modernists like Arthur Wesley Dow. And through these, we can also see the pervasive influence that Asian art, that Eastern art was having on turn of the century artists like Harlan, and as well as photography. And so Harlan's employing these harmonious, simplified fields of color in these paintings. He has a compressed picture frame with flattened perspective. He's got lots of diagonal lines and dashing movement with asymmetrical compositions, and of course, photographically cropped subjects. All of this is very familiar to turn of the century artwork. All the while, Harlan was also rediscovering his love for Northern Kentucky. And I'll read to you a brief passage from the book, which I feel demonstrates Harlan's daily practice that sort of helped mitigate his feelings of quiet desperation while he was rediscovering this beautiful landscape. Harlan ascended and descended the hill at Winters Lane and the hills all over northern Kentucky, sketching and journaling, journaling and sketching, trying to answer his own pressing question. Who was Harlan Hubbard as a painter? In terms of style and execution of his work, he was unsure. But in terms of philosophy, there was one essential concept of which he was absolutely certain. The following words he writes in his journal are from 1937, 10 years after the erection of the Brent studio, but they carry with them the spirit of every entry penned during that long and fretful decade. He says, "The pictures which I paint must be more out of doors, not of the mind, but of the eye and the heart. I must work with real materials, the earth and sky, sun and wind, not with paint, which suggests an idea to the mind. I must not paint through a window, but out in the sun and rain. I will forget the traditions of art, forget I am an artist. That will all take care of itself. As I came down the water, I saw water, shores, and sky in their primitive aspect. Every place seemed alive and honest, even these that are so familiar. I must not let this feeling wear off. The earth must never seem worn." Now, while Harlan was dividing his time between roaming the countryside, having these wonderful experiences in nature, and also still working in construction to support his life in Fort Thomas with his mother, the United States was sliding into the Great Depression. And Harlan and Rose's finances seem to have remained pretty secure during this period. It helped that they not only were working in jobs that Louis and Frank were, first of all, successful, but that Harlan was also working in jobs that still needed to be done. And so things remained pretty secure for them financially. And really, the Depression brought Harlan some exciting new opportunities as a painter. Because in 1934, the federal government instituted the Public Works of Art Project, which was sort of the forerunner to the artistic wings of the WPA. And the PWAP was intended to uplift the nation's visual artists during the Depression and to place patriotic American-made artwork into public spaces across the country. And the PWAP literature cited the project's theme as the American scene, which is a phrase that would later be borrowed to especially describe the work of regionalist painters like Grant Wood and Thomas Hart Benton. And Harlan, having gained some minor recognition in the region as a painter, was approached by the regional chairman for the PWAP to complete 5 commissioned works on this theme for Northern Kentucky. And Harlan was going to be challenged by this commission because, in its purest and most popular form, 1930s regionalism was largely figurative and was most easily recognized by the kinds of writhing bodies and dynamic, vibrant compositions of artists like Thomas Hart Benton, which you're seeing on the screen right now. And the figures that Benton chose to paint represented the movement's desire to sort of remind Americans of their original, if not also mythical, sense of themselves as these robust, active, self-reliant pioneers. Now, Harlan, as we've seen, identified as a landscape painter or a riverscape painter, and he tended to avoid figuration by this point. And he unsuccessfully tried to convince the PWAP board to allow him to do a series of steamboat paintings instead, but ended up producing a somewhat awkward body of regionalist work that are very nice, but in which his discomfort with the subject matter and style is pretty evident. But the exercise was instructive for Harlan, and really in the work of the mid-1930s, we can see him trying to finesse certain aspects of regionalism into his other painting as well. And we certainly see more human figures in Harlan's work of the 1930s than in any other period. And perhaps the most challenging piece of the commission was the proscenium arch mural that was above the stage of the Carnegie Library Auditorium in Covington. And that space was large, it was unusually shaped, it was, of course, difficult to access. These were issues that compounded the existing struggles he was having already with subject matter and style. And so the logistics of painting a mural were also foreign to Harlan. And he actually chose not to paint it traditionally, which would be done in situ with egg tempera on plaster. Instead, he took careful measurements of the space and planned to cut sheets of masonite to size, which he would then paint with oils, and then when they were dry, install them at the Carnegie in sections. And he and the regional PWAP chair had agreed that the title of the mural would be The Spirit of Covington. And so, of course, you see the spirit of Covington, the representation of the city there in the center of the mural. But he also researched and painted 4 additional figures related to the history of Northern Kentucky that he also included in the mural. And so you're looking at Daniel Boone, Simon Kenton, John G. Carlisle, and Mary Draper Ingalls. And many years later, Harlan was both critical and respectful of this work that he did on the Spirit of Covington. On one hand, he's quoted as saying, "It would have relieved my mind of much agony if the building had collapsed into rubble," which is rather dramatic. But he also noted after an impromptu visit to the Carnegie toward the end of his life, he said, "To tell the truth, the old painting was not as bad as I had feared. 50 years had given it a new rhythm and a glow of life that I had not felt before." And I think many of us feel that way when we see this as well. Now, however philosophically unfulfilled Harlan felt about his work for the PWAP at the time, 4 months of work had netted him about $665, which was pretty great in 1934. And this infusion of cash put a little bit of pep in his step. It gave him a little bit of confidence to pursue his first solo exhibitions as a painter. And so in 1935 and 1936, he displayed two collections of new work each year at the Getz Brown Gallery in Cincinnati to pretty good reviews. But Harlan also was finding himself longing for a new studio. And he had given up his first studio that I mentioned in the lumber mill at the beginning of the 1930s. And since that time, Harlan had basically been painting at home in his bedroom or in the basement of 129 Highland Avenue. And naturally, he missed the solitude and the space of a private place to create. And so in May 1934, after he finished all of his PWAP pieces, he discovered a small cabin for rent on some farmland right along the river road near Ross, Kentucky. And Harlan rented it as a studio for nearly 4 years until Rose, his mother, who disliked the 18-mile distance between Ross and Fort Thomas, requested that he find a place to work that was closer to home. So he took this rather literally. And what you're looking at on the screen is the studio he constructed in the backyard of the house he shared with his mother in Fort Thomas. And this studio, completed in 1938, was largely inspired by some of the barns and homes that he was familiar seeing near his studios, both on Winters Lane and out in Ross, that were built in the German vernacular style of the region. And a hallmark of this is not only that rough stone foundation, but also building these structures directly into the hilly terrain of the region. And this is a technique that, of course, he would repeat later when he built the structures at Payne Hollow, which we'll talk about. But you'll note that he also used a mishmash of local and recycled and salvaged materials to construct this studio. And that was something else, of course, that would figure prominently in his designs for future buildings. And now we find ourselves back where we started at the beginning of this presentation, at a turning point in Harlan Hubbard's life, on the verge of this second act. And even Harlan seems to have felt this sort of liminal quality to his life in the late 1930s, because he wrote in his journal in 1936, "What great event in my life am I waiting for?" And I've already spoiled that for you. Her name was Anna Wonder Eichenout, and she was an elegant, soft-spoken, deeply intelligent librarian from Grand Rapids, Michigan, who had been working at the reference desk of the Fine Arts Library in Cincinnati when she met Harlan. And they bonded very politely at first over a shared interest in books and history and art and music. But it was Anna who, when she learned that Harlan could play the violin, that she became bold and asked if they might play music together, which they did. And she was an accomplished musician in her own right, and I should note, pretty advanced over Harlan. But she had been playing piano from a little girl, and music formed a strong foundation in her and Harlan's courtship and their eventual marriage. And in one of my favorite quotes of Harlan's, he alludes to her really generous musicality. And he says, "Anna was a wonderful accompanist. It was her strongest point. She never lost her place, and she never lost me." Now, as you might imagine, the courtship between Harlan and Anna was pretty difficult on Harlan's mother, Rose, who still depended on her son for nearly everything. There's some more details about that in the book, but despite the tension with Rose, Harlan and Anna decided to marry on April 20th, 1943, and they got married in Maysville, Kentucky. And they planned to start their life living in that studio that Harlan built that was in the back of 129 Highland Avenue. And there they would be close enough to care for Rose in her advancing age and infirmity, but far enough to enjoy some of their own newlywed privacy. And this was a difficult period for the nation with World War II, for the Hubbards with Rose's illness and with this tension between Rose and Anna. But both Harlan and Anna managed to find a good deal of joy in their new circumstances. They loved being crushed together in this studio, subsisting only with the bare essentials, learning how to make a home from what they could make, what they could grow, what they could forage. And as Harlan wrote to his brother Frank, we are all very well here, taking what advantages we can. We have had a lot of fun canning fruit and vegetables, practically all from the garden and countryside. Wild strawberries, raspberries, and blackberries, tomatoes, beans, apples, etc. Anna takes great interest in it and does it very well. They also took great pleasure in reading to one another and, of course, playing music with one another. And Anna had made it very, very clear that they must find room in the small studio for her to have her upright piano from her apartment. So this life was sort of an experiment, a prelude to the liberated shantyboat experience that Harlan had craved since he was a little boy. Now, Rose Hubbard died on November 16th, 1943, just 3 days shy of turning 84. And this was a very complicated moment for Harlan, because even though he was very proud to have been a dutiful son to his mother, he recognized that for the first time since he was 21 years old, and remember, this is 1943, so he's 43, he was suddenly free to make his own choices. Of course, free within the confines of his marriage to Anna and her wishes, but he felt far more understood and accepted by her than he ever had by his mother. And only a few years earlier, he had written in his journal, "The only life I can honorably follow is one that no woman would accept." And yet, here was Anna. And it was clear that Anna was looking forward to the promise of some adventure too. She had married this unconventional man, and for all of her politeness and her neat appearance, she was perfectly prepared for an unconventional life, ready, in fact. And in fact, it was Anna who nudged the couple ultimately along to their remarkable second act, because in 1944, after many discussions with Harlan about what now might lay ahead, Anna told him now is the time to build the shantyboat we have talked of for so long. And so Harlan and Anna decided to build a shantyboat at Brent, Kentucky, not far from where Harlan had established his first painting studio, where there at Brent there was already an established community of shantyboaters. And Harlan and Anna knew that they would be needing a lot of guidance in this exciting new venture that they were embarking on, so it was good to have shantyboaters nearby who knew what they were doing. And they moved there to the riverbank at Brent on October 6th, 1944, and established a rough camp on the riverbank while the boat came together. And Harlan, all the while, was enthralled by Anna's capacity for this unusual life. And he wrote of her, "I ceased my hammering to watch Anna as she moved about the stony beach, tending the fire and cooking, setting the rude table with camp tinware as carefully as if it were fine china and silver upon a linen cloth. She was tall and slender, fair-haired. I marveled that she could keep her clothes so neat and clean. Even her camp slacks were smart and trim. Then I thought momentarily that the approaching months of shantyboating and riverbank might be a trying ordeal to one so constituted. But I was confident that she would evolve a pattern which, while still giving scope to my wild longings, would satisfy her innate delicacy, her femininity, and self-respect. She would make something of our shantyboat life that her friends and family would respect and admire and enjoy, even though some of them might look askance from the beginning." And after all, he mentions looking askance at the beginning with shantyboaters, because most people who historically lived in shantyboats were not necessarily shantyboaters by choice. Like the Hubbards, they were shantyboaters by necessity. Often they were driven to the riverbank out of poverty or other sorts of social exclusion. And so as a result, shantyboaters sometimes earned a bad reputation in the neighboring towns and cities. And a few of Harlan and Anna's Fort Thomas neighbors certainly couldn't understand why Harlan and Anna would want to leave a perfectly good house in town to live with the rabble on the river. But Harlan and Anna saw more in the shantyboat ethos, far more than desperation, far more than poverty, far more than outcasts. They saw the American pioneer spirit and the philosophical ideal of much in little. Nevertheless, the Hubbard shantyboat had a different level of panache than the traditional Ohio River shantyboat. The Hubbards had installed beautiful wide windows in their shantyboat. They had a working cook stove and shelves stuffed with books and sheet music and art supplies and canned goods. They also had their loyal dog, Skipper, who would eventually have 9 litters of puppies during the shantyboat years. And you can see Harlan here on the screen holding the first of those litters in this photograph. Now, the Hubbards lived actually just tied up at Brent from September 1944 to December 1946. And they loved living there in the shantyboat community, making friends, learning invaluable tips from their fellow river dwellers. But they eventually began to feel a growing desire to experience that delight of drifting. And they had no precise timeline developed for this drifting adventure they wanted to achieve, but they did know that they wanted to take this new home down the entire length of the Ohio and Mississippi rivers to New Orleans. And over the course of the next 6 years, the Hubbards spent their winters and early springs, which were high water time on the river and best for navigating this tempestuous river current, occasionally having to beach the boat when the water turned to dangerous, crushing ice jams. And then in summer and fall, um, they would find obliging landowners near where they had decided they wanted to settle. Sometimes these landowners would have a cottage to rent them, and they would tie up their shanty boat and plant a garden and harvest that garden. And their first such summer was in 1947. And they spent it at a little place near Madison, Indiana, on the Kentucky side of the river called Payne's Landing. And if you're familiar with the Hubbard story, you know we'll be coming back to that. But their first shantyboat summer there, and then the successive summers, they raised these crops and caught fish, and then would lovingly can these products that became the rations for the winters of drifting ahead. And in their spare time, of course, the couple revived their common hobbies of reading aloud from literature and poetry, of answering correspondence, of playing music together. And no, Anna did not bring a piano on the shanty boat. She actually learned and mastered the cello so that she could have an instrument with her on the shanty boat. And so that's a pretty remarkable thing. But Harlan, of course, found time to create art as well, sketching and painting as they made their way to the Gulf. And the Grand Shantyboat epic ended after a sojourn through the Intracoastal Waterway and its network of bayous. And when the Hubbards reached the point of New Orleans on April 7th, 1951, just a few weeks shy of their 9th wedding anniversary, they decided to explore these bayous a little bit, and they purchased a boat with a small motor so that they could tow the shanty boat through the bayous and stop at different places. But finally, in the summer of 1951, they made the difficult decision to put the shanty boat up for sale and move on to the next adventure. They sold their shanty boat to a family near Bayou d'Aucambe, and you're looking at a painting that Harlan made of Bayou d'Aucambe on the screen. And then they purchased a used car, they fashioned a camping trailer, and this car and trailer would carry them on an extended journey for the next year out west toward California to see Louis, and then coming home again to Kentucky. And by this point, at the beginning of 1952, Harlan and Anna were immersed in 2 pretty big projects. The first, of course, was turning their shantyboat adventures into a published book. And with Harlan's brother Frank's help in New York, they found a publisher for the book. That was Dodd Mead and Company. And if you remember, again, I'll mention that shantyboat was initially called Driftwood, but changed to shantyboat and was released in 1953. And Harlan illustrated the entire publication, including this very dynamic and colorful first edition slip jacket, which is just incredible. But the other project, of course, was finding a new place to settle. They were determined to put down roots somewhere that would help them maintain this shantyboat spirit that they had cultivated on solid ground. And so they were revisiting a few of the different spots that had struck them from their drifting days. And their minds kept returning to one place. And that one place was Payne's Landing, that little slice of wilderness where they had spent their first shantyboat summer. And the owner, Ansel McCord, agreed to sell them 7 acres of the land, which Harlan and Anna had taken to calling Payne Hollow instead of Payne's Landing. And they started to build a permanent residence there in September of 1952. And like the land where Harlan built the studio in Fort Thomas, Payne Hollow has a steep grade. And so Harlan's experience with building into hillsides really came in handy as he and Anna constructed the first cabin in their new home of Payne Hollow. And that cabin, later expanded to 2 rooms in 1954, was initially no larger than their shantyboat living quarters. And you can see that cabin here in June 1954 before they made the addition. Harlan and Anna's first Christmas at Payne Hollow came not long after the completion of this original cabin. And they spent that cold winter finalizing the shantyboat manuscript to send to Harlan's editor, Edward Dodd. But they also enjoyed the stark natural beauty of this place that they had chosen to call home. They both loved winter and they loved seeing the Ohio River in winter. And during this time, you can get a little glimpse of what Payne Hollow looked like then. Harlan completed this lovely watercolor as a Christmas gift for Anna, in which he highlights the very distinctive upriver land feature jutting out there into the river that he called Plow Handle Point. And like Georgia O'Keeffe painted Pedernal, and John Marin painted Bear Mountain, and Cézanne painted Mount Saint Victoire, Harlan would return to this form of Plow Handle Point again and again as a subject in his painting while at Payne Hollow. Now, after the joyful exertions of setting down roots at Payne Hollow, Harlan and Anna just flourished there. Harlan experienced a really intense creative renaissance through the interdisciplinary challenges of maintaining this life that was what they would eventually call on the fringe. And it's important to remember that they were living an existence without traditional plumbing, with no desire for electricity, and really with a limited reliance at all on money or on commerce. Instead, they were almost entirely self-sufficient, growing, foraging, catching, butchering, bartering for most of their own food, chopping their own wood, heating their own house. And in every task that he completed at Payne Hollow, Harlan practiced gratitude for this remarkable life that was so different than his life had been before Anna, B.A. And for this beautiful life that he and Anna were building in this hard-earned river paradise. And I also want to take a moment to laud Anna for her incredible contributions to this work of art that was the Hubbard's life. Even though Anna often said that she wasn't creative, her less tangible creativity, her artistry, pervades this domestic ecosystem that they created. And her quiet brilliance resulted in a remarkably organized, balanced life for the Hubbards there in Payne Hollow, equal in its function as in its beauty. And Anna Hubbard made day-to-day life at Payne Hollow as efficient as her and bespoke as her husband's physical structures. She managed their nutrition, adapting the learned practices of organic gardening, of foraging, of preserving foodstuffs into this really healthy and delicious diet that was specifically tailored to their place, to their lifestyle, and to their individual needs. Anna also often provided the lilting soundtrack to Harlan's activities, to his gardening, to his woodcutting, to his fishing, with constant practice on her family's heirloom Steinway baby grand piano. And yes, that is a Steinway baby grand piano that they trucked in a tractor all the way down into Payne Hollow. And not only was it one piano that they trucked down into there, it was the second piano that they had trucked down into Payne Hollow. So the first one being that upright that had been in the Fort Thomas studio when they first moved in. And all of the visitors that the Hubbards entertained at Payne Hollow were struck by the practical demonstration of a set of values that felt in this post-industrial world just remarkably radical, remarkably unfamiliar. And as one writer commented in 1977, before my eyes unfolded as quiet but as profound a revolution as will ever be my privilege to bear witness to. And Payne Hollow was, in many ways, at least in part, an achievable utopia, even more accessible sometimes and just as poetic as Henry David Thoreau's Walden. And naturally, this concept of a modern Walden lent itself to another book project. And so Harlan's Payne Hollow manuscript ended up being shorter than Shantyboat and with a slightly different pacing and tone. And so he had some difficulty finding publishers for it at first, but he did finally, thankfully, find a home for it at Eakins Press in 1973, published in 1974. And as with Shantyboat, Harlan provided beautiful pen and ink illustrations for the cover, for the end pages, and for the chapter headings. But Harlan's creativity did not stop with this new book. In 1956, Harlan had begun building a new workshop and painting studio uphill from the main house there at Payne Hollow. That was constructed with a very similar sensitivity to locally sourced and recycled construction materials. And beyond simply providing Harlan a very practical place to store and use the hundreds of tools that were required to maintain their lives there at Payne Hollow, the new building gave Harlan a dedicated place to paint again, which, as we've observed, was very important for Harlan. And in the studio portion of the upper level of this studio, which you're looking at an interior shot here from the 1970s of his studio, Harlan installed an enormous canted window, which allowed ideal, bright, indirect daylight to just pour onto his stacks of masonite and paper and his dry pigments and linseed oil, brushes, pencils, charcoal. And the space inspired a new creative flush of painting for the artist that would last until his death. And throughout this period, Harlan synthesizes a new aesthetic that sort of combines the work that he had been doing in sketches and watercolors with the more impressionistic or realistic tendencies in his completed oils and acrylics. And we can observe both of those styles coexisting in his work from the 1960s and 70s and recognize it through these black outlines that you see here that function sort of like a signature tracery. And really, to me, those black outlines are the evidence of some of Harlan's most unique and mature artistic voice. And nowhere is that maturity more evident than in this series of large-scale, and I mean large-scale, commissions for the then new branch of Citizens State Bank in Owensboro, Kentucky. This is a 5-painting series. You can see 3 of them here that are telling the river history of Owensboro through these beautiful paintings. But they're just remarkable masterworks. And again, you can see just incredible innovations in the way that he's manipulating the sense of water in these paintings, for example. Very masterful. And even up until the year before he died, and he died in 1988, 2 years after his beloved wife Anna. Even up until the year before he died, Harlan could be found almost every day in his studio, experimenting with new styles, with new techniques. And one of my favorite quotes from Harlan's correspondence is a line that he wrote in sort of the ecstasy of one of these experimental moods. And he says, "This is very exciting and offers endless possibilities. Is this evolution? Is my painting rising to new levels?" So even in his late 80s, Harlan was thinking about how he was evolving, how his work was evolving and changing. And this was indeed evolution. You can see the beginnings of new styles coming in this period, although sadly it's an evolution whose product we can really only imagine. Now, fortunately, and perhaps surprisingly, both Harlan and Anna got to continue living at Payne Hollow right into their 80s. And besides the valuable assistance that they did get from friends, especially from a young man named Paul Hassfurter, who would eventually come to inherit the house and land on Harlan's death, besides this valuable assistance from friends who could take on the harder labor of living at Payne Hollow, Harlan and Anna were able to remain largely self-sufficient until they both became too ill to remain. Anna died, as I mentioned, in 1986, and Harlan died in 1988. Both of them died from complications of cancer. Uh, but they were very loved and surrounded by friends by when the time came. And you see here that their remains rest under a beautiful carved gravestone in their beloved Payne Hollow to this day. So they are still there at Payne Hollow together. And today I'll mention that today a nonprofit organization named Payne Hollow on the Ohio is currently restoring and protecting the land and structures there at Payne Hollow. And so I would encourage you to take some time to look them up and learn about their valuable work and the way that they're trying to preserve the incredible legacy that Harlan and Anna left behind. And although there's still so much more we could talk about, it's time to wind this presentation down. And as promised, I'm coming back to this painting of Harlan's that I mentioned at the beginning that I used to stare at in the Hanover College Library. And by the way, you still can stare at this painting in the Hanover College Library. It's just no longer behind the circulation desk. But I mentioned that I always felt like the river was drawing me into this painting. And sure, I knew this view. Many of you probably know this view. This is the view, the famous overlook from Hanover's campus looking downriver on the Ohio. But what I didn't know about this view was that there was a magnetic force here, and especially a magnetic force in this composition that was very intentional, not just for aesthetic reasons, because this is a very well composed painting, but also for philosophical ones, because where you see this circle here, right at the center of this view, right at the center of this painting, and right at the center of the Hubbard story was the promise and beauty of Payne Hollow. And that beauty is still there today and still resonates with the Hubbard story. So I want to thank you so much for your attention today, for allowing me to share a bit of the Driftwood story with you. As I mentioned, there's much more to learn from the book and the associated programs and exhibits. So please feel free to visit my website or to follow me on social media to keep up with latest news and to order copies of the book. And I'll also just throw out there a few quick dates for you of events that are coming up soon before I turn you back over to the lovely ladies of the Behringer-Crawford Museum. The first one you already heard about, which is that on April 13th, 2025, the Behringer-Crawford Museum will be opening an exciting new exhibit based on Driftwood, the Life of Harlan Hubbard. And so please stay tuned for more details on that. I hope to see you all at the opening. It should be really exciting. And then I also wanted to mention that the official release party for the book will be held on February 25th. That will be at the Filson Historical Society in Louisville. Please join us if you can for a really special evening when you can also hear the world premiere of a special new piece by composer Daniel Gillum, Piano Trio No. 2, Payne Hollow, which is inspired by the Hubbard story. And if you can't make it on the 25th, there will be another chance to see that piece of music on April 23rd in Covington at the Carnegie, right underneath that beautiful proscenium arch mural we discussed of Harlan's in this presentation. So be sure to check back on the website, stay in touch with the Behringer-Crawford, and check for registration links as they come available.
That's all we have time for this evening. Thank you again to all of our sponsors and supporters of BCM. Until next time, take care, everyone, and good night.